You've tuned in for another deep dive, and you, our listener, have brought us some really intriguing stuff to chew on this time. We're diving headfirst into a particular viewpoint on end times prophecy that's, well, it's sparking a lot of conversation.
Yeah, the idea of an Islamic Antichrist.
Exactly.
So we're going to be exploring the arguments laid out by Joel Richardson in his books, The Islamic Antichrist and Mideast Beast. They present a really detailed case for this perspective.
Right. And we've also got that YouTube interview with him, the one on the Vlad Savchuk Espanol channel.
Yep, that's the one where he unpacks his ideas, responds to objections. It's quite good.
So our goal today is to really dissect this for you.
Yeah.
We want to understand the biblical foundation Richardson offers, kind of get to grips with his core arguments.
And see how it connects or might connect with everything happening in the Middle East now.
Absolutely. Honestly, looking at these sources, it's not hard to see why so many people have had a real whoa moment reading this stuff.
Yeah, like a fundamental shift in how they understand these scriptures.
Get ready for some potential light bulb moments, I think.
Definitely. Now, before we even get into the specifics of the Antichrist figure itself, Richardson emphasizes some really key principles for how we should approach the Bible.
Yeah, foundational ideas.
What are some of those?
Well, the big one, and he says it over and over, is context, context, context.
Right.
He really hammers home that the Bible is deeply rooted in Jerusalem and Israel. I mean, when you think about it, all the major biblical narratives, they unfold right there.
Geographically specific.
Totally. He argues we have to keep that geographical focus front and center, especially when we're looking at prophecies about the end times. He sees those as primarily focused on the lands surrounding Israel.
That's a critical starting point. And he also cautions against something he calls Americanizing the Bible.
Or, bringing our modern Western way of thinking into these ancient texts. Why is he so insistent on that?
Well, because he believes that if we do that, we risk totally missing the original meaning. It's like trying to understand, cricket. If all you know is baseball, you'll probably get something seriously wrong.
Analogy.
He argues we need to step back, understand the cultural setting of the Bible, rather than just reading our own assumptions into it.
Makes sense. So once we accept that need for context, how does he suggest we actually approach reading and understanding these scriptures? Like, where do we begin?
He advocates starting with the clear stuff, the repeated themes in the Bible before we even think about tackling the more complex symbolic things.
Okay, build the foundation first.
Exactly. It's like learning anything. You build a solid base with the fundamentals before you try to master the advanced techniques. Get to grips with the straightforward passages first, he says, and then move towards the more layered prophetic and apocalyptic imagery. It's a pretty logical approach, really.
Yeah, it is. And within this framework, he highlights a really central idea for understanding end times prophecy as a whole. What's that key concept?
It's the day of the Lord. Now, he clarifies that it's not just a single 24-hour period, like the name might suggest.
Right, not just one day.
No, instead, he says it's more like a major era in God's plan, a significant period that's centered around the return of Jesus.
So like a whole season, almost.
Kind of, yeah. Think of it as a major historical period with a clear beginning, middle, and end. And surrounding that central event, Jesus' return, are the things that come before, like the tribulation, the rise of the Antichrist, and the things that come after, the establishment of his kingdom on earth.
Okay, let's dig a little deeper then. When we look at Richardson's specific arguments about the Antichrist figure, what's the heart of his biblical case for this Middle Eastern and North African coalition idea?
His main point, and it really does make you stop and think, is that every single time the Bible talks about the nations, peoples, tribes, or regions that will be allied with the Antichrist or part of his empire and invade Israel, the names mentioned consistently point to countries right there in the Middle East or North Africa, surrounding Israel.
Every time. He really stresses that.
He emphasizes this isn't just in a few places, but in every passage, every verse. That's his claim.
Wow. Okay. And what's the big implication of that pattern he identifies?
He points out something really significant. The complete absence of any European nations being specifically named as part of this Antichrist alliance in those particular prophecies.
Right.
Now, he's careful to say, look, this doesn't automatically mean European nations won't have any role to play.
Sure, they could be involved somehow.
But the consistent biblical focus, he argues, is squarely on the Middle East.
So the takeaway is he's challenging centuries of Western interpretation by pointing to this consistent geography in the text itself.
Exactly, suggesting we might be looking in the wrong direction, for the Antichrist's origins.
Which is a pretty significant departure from how many people in the West typically understand these prophecies.
Totally. He argues that a lot of us in the West have been taught, through tradition really, to anticipate a more Western-centric Antichrist figure and his allies.
Yeah, that's the common picture.
He even suggests we might need to actively unlearn some of these long-held ideas to really grasp what the Bible is communicating. It definitely makes you question how you've always pictured these end-time scenarios.
It really does. Okay, let's shift focus a bit to the imagery around Christ's return. Richardson highlights Revelation 19, which refers back to Isaiah 63, and speaks of the Messiah's robes being stained with blood. According to his interpretation, whose blood is that?
Okay, here's where it gets really powerful. And yeah, it might challenge some of our more comfortable Western ideas about Jesus.
How so?
Richardson argues that this isn't the blood of martyrs, and it's not even primarily about Christ's own sacrificial blood from the cross.
Okay.
Instead, he says it's the blood of his enemies. Those he treads down in judgment like grapes being crushed in a winepress.
Wow, that's intense imagery.
It is, and it comes straight from the Old Testament. From passages like Isaiah 63, where Yahweh is depicted marching from the south, his clothes stained from this very winepress of his foes. It really forces you to reconsider the common, maybe more passive image we often have, doesn't it?
It certainly paints a different picture than the gentle shepherd image that's so prevalent in Western Christian art.
Exactly. Richardson points out that in Western depictions, Jesus is often shown as peaceful, maybe holding a lamb. But the picture we get in Revelation, drawing on these Old Testament prophecies, is of a victorious warrior.
Right.
He treads his enemies like grapes. It's a really visceral and forceful image.
He also connects this back to what many consider the very first messianic prophecy, right?
Yeah.
Genesis.
Yeah, he's talking about Genesis 3.15, where God tells the serpent that the Messiah, the seed of the woman, will crush its head. Richardson emphasizes that right from the beginning, the first prophecy about the coming Messiah portrays him as the ultimate conqueror of evil, and by extension, those who align themselves with the serpent, Satan.
So this idea of the Messiah as a warrior isn't something new in the New Testament.
Not at all. It's there right at the dawn of Scripture, according to this view.
And he brings in other Old Testament examples too.
Absolutely. He mentions Habakkuk 3 as a particularly vivid Old Testament description of the Messiah's return as a powerful divine warrior marching in judgment.
Okay.
And he draws an interesting parallel. He talks about the Pharisees in Jesus' time who maybe struggled with the idea of a suffering Messiah because their expectation was all about a conquering king.
Right. They were expecting liberation from Rome.
Exactly. And he suggests that perhaps some modern Christians might similarly struggle with the judging and conquering aspects of Christ's return, maybe focusing too much on his first coming as the suffering servant.
And not enough on his return in glory and power.
That's the idea.
That contrast in expectations is a really thought-provoking point. Now, Richardson also delves into the differing Greek and Hebrew worldviews on the end times. What's the fundamental distinction he draws there, and how does that impact how we interpret prophecy?
Okay, the core difference, as he explains it, lies in how they view the physical world. The biblical Hebrew perspective sees both the spiritual and the physical creation as inherently good, created by God.
Okay.
And the promise is that after the Messiah's return, everything, heaven and earth, will be restored, unified. It's all part of God's good creation that will be redeemed.
So redemption of the physical, not escape from it.
Precisely. On the other hand, the Greek, especially the Platonic worldview, tended to see the physical world as flawed, maybe even corrupt, something to be escaped.
Right. Spirit good, matter bad sort of thing?
Kind of, yeah. The focus there is on the spiritual realm as the truly good and eternal, with the physical being more temporary or even negative. So it's like one view says the ultimate goal is to escape this dusty old house, the physical world, and live in a perfect cloud.
Oh, yeah.
While the other says God's going to renovate the house completely and make it brand new.
Okay, I get the distinction.
Yeah.
And how does this Greek perspective then influence how some people interpret biblical prophecy?
Richardson argues that this Greek influence can lead to a tendency to spiritualize things, to allegorize literal biblical passages.
So looking for symbolic meanings instead of the plain sense.
Exactly. Instead of taking them at face value, interpreters might look for a purely symbolic or spiritual meaning, potentially missing the actual intended significance. He gives the example of prophecies about the nation of Israel being applied allegorically to the church.
Rather than seeing a literal future for the physical nation of Israel.
Right. He also mentions a passage about the Lord leading prisoners forth with singing. He says a Greek lens might see this purely spiritually, whereas the literal meaning could be the Messiah freeing people from actual physical captivity.
That's a really crucial distinction to understand. Okay, let's move on to Daniel 2 and Nebuchadnezzar's famous dream of the statue. Traditionally, that fourth kingdom is identified as Rome. What's Richardson's argument for seeing it as the Islamic Empire instead?
Okay, so yeah, for centuries, the standard interpretation has been that sequence: Babylon, Persia, Greece, and then Rome. Richardson challenges that final identification. He argues that the fourth kingdom, the one with legs of iron and feet of iron and clay, actually symbolizes the Islamic Empire.
Okay, bold claim. What's his basis?
He bases this on several key details within the text itself.
What are the main textual points he focuses on?
Firstly, if you look at Daniel 2, verse 34, it says that when the Messianic kingdom, the stone cut out without hands, strikes and destroys this fourth kingdom.
Right, the stone that smashes it.
All the other kingdoms, Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece, are destroyed at the same time.
Yeah.
Richardson argues this strongly suggests that the fourth kingdom must somehow be a continuation or a successor in the same geographical and cultural sphere as those earlier Middle Eastern empires.
Those geographically linked.
Right. Not a geographically separate entity like Rome, which rose later and in a different part of the world. The interconnectedness of their destruction points to an interconnectedness of their origins in that region.
That makes a compelling case for a regional link. What's the second textual point he emphasizes?
In Daniel 2, verse 41, it states that this fourth kingdom will crush the others: Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece.
Okay.
Richardson argues that historically, the early Islamic conquests more thoroughly crushed and absorbed the territories and cultures of those previous Middle Eastern empires than the Roman Empire did.
More completely.
Yeah. While Rome certainly conquered parts of those regions, the Islamic expansion led to a more fundamental and lasting reshaping of the Middle East, in his view.
He draws a contrast between the nature of Roman and early Islamic imperial rule too, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. He contrasts Roman rule, which often involved, establishing infrastructure, maintaining elements of Greek culture, focusing on extracting resources,
Building roads, aqueducts.
that sort of thing. He contrasts that with the early Islamic conquests, which he describes as frequently involving the outright destruction of cities, sometimes extermination of populations, seizure of property.
A different character of conquest.
A different and in many ways more devastating form of imperial expansion in those early centuries, he argues.
And what about the prophecy that this kingdom would be divided? How does that fit?
Daniel 2.41 mentions the kingdom will be divided. Now, while the Roman Empire did eventually split, east and west,
Right.
Richardson points to the much earlier and arguably more permanent division within Islam itself, the Shia and Sunni split.
Which happened relatively soon after Muhammad.
Exactly. He argues that this ongoing fundamental division within Islam aligns more closely with the prophecy of a divided kingdom than the later Roman split.
Interesting. Finally, what's his take on the mixed nature of the feet, made of iron and clay?
Daniel 2.43 describes this kingdom as being mixed, and Richardson connects the Hebrew word used there, merab, to the Arabic word Arab.
Oh, like a linguistic link.
Yeah. He suggests this could be a subtle linguistic clue within the text itself, hinting at an Arab-dominated kingdom in the end times. It's a fascinating idea that the very language of the prophecy might point towards the identity of this final empire.
Okay, let's turn our attention now to Daniel 9.26. This speaks of the people of the prince who is to come, destroying Jerusalem. The traditional interpretation links this to the Romans under Titus in 70 AD.
That's the standard view, yes.
What's Richardson's alternative interpretation?
Richardson certainly acknowledges that's been the standard understanding for a long time, but he raises a couple of really important counterpoints.
Right.
First, he cites historical sources, including Josephus, which detail the ethnic makeup of the Roman legions that actually destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD. These sources indicate that a significant portion of those soldiers were actually from the Middle East and North Africa, Syrians, Arabs.
Really? Not just Italians?
No. He points out that recruitment practices under Roman emperors like Augustus had shifted towards drawing more soldiers from the provinces. So even if it was the Roman army, its ranks were heavily populated by people from the very region Richardson believes the Antichrist will emerge from.
That's a really significant historical detail about the composition of those Roman forces.
Wow. What's his second key point on this? His second point is even more fundamental. He doesn't even believe that Daniel 9.26 is referring to the events of 70 AD in the first place.
Oh, why not?
He stresses that the prophecy of the 70 weeks in Daniel has a very specific timeline. And he argues that the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD actually falls outside of that prophetic window.
So it's chronologically misplaced in the prophecy.
That's his argument. He believes there was a pause in the prophetic timeline after the crucifixion of the Messiah. Therefore, the people of the prince who is to come refers to an end times event, not necessarily the historical destroyers of Jerusalem in the first century.
Okay.
He also notes that the Hebrew word used here, am, meaning people, could further suggest an ethnic connection to the Antichrist's followers in the last days.
Moving on to Ezekiel 38:39, the famous Gog and Magog prophecy. This is often interpreted in the West as predicting a Russian invasion, right? The king of the north.
That's the common view, yeah. Russia egalled.
What's Richardson's perspective on the geographical references in that prophecy?
He directly challenges that common Western view. He argues that if you look at the geographical names mentioned in Ezekiel's time, places like Magog, Meshech, Tubal, Beth Togarmah, these all corresponded to regions in Asia Minor, which is essentially modern-day Turkey.
Turkey, not Russia.
That's his argument. So the Antichrist figure, or at least this key leader, might actually originate from Turkey, with Russia potentially playing a significant, but perhaps more secondary or peripheral role.
Like a major ally, maybe, but not the main player?
Something like that. Similar to how a major power like the US or China might be involved in a global conflict today without being the absolute central driving force prophesied here.
And what's his understanding of the Hebrew word Rosh in that prophecy? Because it sounds a lot like Russia.
He clarifies that while the word Rosh sounds similar, its primary meaning in Hebrew is simply head or chief. So a more accurate translation of the phrase might be the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal rather than specifically pointing to Russia.
So the sound similarity might just be a coincidence.
He argues it likely is. He even makes the point that the word Rosh appears hundreds of times throughout the Old Testament meaning head, and it's only in this very specific prophetic context that it's often interpreted as Russia, which he sees as, well, inconsistent linguistics.
Okay, that's important context.
Yeah.
Let's delve into the theology of the Antichrist as it's described in Daniel 11. What are the key characteristics that Richardson draws our attention to there?
Richardson highlights 4 key statements made about this figure in Daniel 11. First, it says he will deny the God of his fathers. Richardson understands that to mean the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, fundamentally a rejection of the God of the Bible.
Okay.
Second, it says he will show no regard for women. Now, Richardson interprets this, drawing on Hebrew cultural understanding, not necessarily as a statement about, say, sexual orientation,
right,
but as a rejection of the messianic hope. He explains that the desire of women was apparently a Hebrew idiom for the longing for the Messiah.
Oh, interesting. Like in Genesis 3.15, or the desire of nations in Haggai.
Exactly, that deep longing for the promised seed. So rejecting that desire means rejecting the Messiah. It's a really interesting cultural nuance he brings out.
That is fascinating. What are the other key characteristics he points out from Daniel 11?
Third, Daniel 11 states that the Antichrist will not regard any other god, seemingly positioning himself as the sole object of worship or authority. However, the fourth crucial point is that he will honor a god of fortresses or a god of war. And he will do so lavishly with gold, silver, precious stones.
The God of war.
Richardson connects this directly to the historical and theological understanding of Allah as a deity associated with war and conquest within the Islamic tradition, particularly in the Middle East.
So rejecting the biblical God, rejecting other traditional deities, but elevating and serving a God associated with military might.
That's the picture he paints based on Daniel 11.
Okay, this sets the stage for understanding what seems like a contradiction with 2 Thessalonians 2, where Paul says the Antichrist will sit in the temple and claim to be God.
Right.
How does Richardson reconcile this with the strict monotheism of Islam? No God but Allah.
He acknowledges it seems like a direct conflict. His proposed way of understanding this is that the Antichrist, sitting in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God, might not necessarily involve him explicitly stating, "I am Allah," or "I am God" in the ultimate sense.
Okay, so how then?
Instead, it could mean him taking God's place of authority, acting as if he possesses divine power, demanding ultimate allegiance, setting himself up where God should be worshipped.
Oh, usurping God's position.
Exactly. He explains that the temple, from a biblical perspective, is the earthly representation of God's throne. So, by establishing himself in a position of supreme authority within it, he would effectively be proclaiming himself to be in God's place.
And how does this connect back to the description in Daniel 11?
Well, he points out that Daniel 11 also says the Antichrist will speak monstrous things against the God of gods.
Right.
This raises the question, which God is he claiming to be if he's also blaspheming the Most High?
Good point.
Richardson suggests that the Antichrist will elevate himself above the God of the temple, effectively seizing earthly religious authority while still honoring his own God of war and speaking out against the true God. It's complex.
It is. Now, the imagery in Revelation chapters 12, 13, 17, the woman, the beast, the child, incredibly symbolic. Richardson interprets the beast as representing empires that oppose God, culminating in the Ottoman Empire.
Yes, that's a key part of his framework.
What's his argument for a potential future revival of this wounded beast?
Richardson sees the beast throughout Revelation as representing successive empires that stand in opposition to God and his people. He argues that the historical progression of these empires ultimately leads to the Ottoman Empire, which held dominion over much of the Middle East for centuries.
Okay.
He identifies the fatal wound mentioned in Revelation 13 as the abolishment of the Caliphate in 1923 by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk.
Right. And for listeners who might not be familiar, what exactly is the Caliphate?
Essentially, the Caliphate is an Islamic state or empire, and the Caliph is considered the supreme religious, political, and military leader of the global Muslim community, the Ummah.
Okay, unified leader.
Right. It's a concept with deep historical and legal roots in Islam. Richardson highlights the symbolic significance of the 100-year anniversary of the Caliphate's abolishment, which was just recently, in 2023.
And what events around that time does he point to as potentially significant?
Well, he mentions reports of large public gatherings in Istanbul, Turkey. President Erdogan gave speeches that included rhetoric that, well, some interpreted as hinting at a desire to exert greater influence in the region, even mentioning Jerusalem. Richardson sees this, along with other geopolitical developments and increasingly strong rhetoric against Israel in some circles, as potential indicators of a desire to revive the Ottoman Empire, or at least the Caliphate in some form.
Drawing parallels to concerning historical periods.
Yeah.
And how does this potential revived caliphate tie into Islamic eschatology, their beliefs about the end times?
Richardson raises the question, could this coming leader, possibly a revived caliph, be the Mahdi?
The Mahdi, who is?
He's a highly significant messianic figure in Islamic tradition. The Mahdi is expected to unite Muslims and lead them to victory over their enemies in the end times.
Okay.
Richardson points out Islamic traditions that describe the Mahdi reigning for 7 years.
7 years. That sounds familiar.
Exactly. And establishing his authority on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. These parallels are really striking when you compare them to Christian prophecies about the Antichrist.
Speaking of parallels, Richardson draws several interesting comparisons between the figures in Christian end times belief and Islamic end times belief.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating.
What are some of the most notable similarities he highlights?
Well, he lays it out like this. Christianity anticipates one ultimate good figure, Christ, and two primary bad figures, the Antichrist and the false prophet.
Right.
Islam includes one major evil figure, the Ad-Dajjal, who some traditions say will claim to be Jesus or even God.
Okay, the deceiver.
Right. And two figures considered righteous. The Mahdi, who we just mentioned, and the Islamic Jesus. Now, it's important to note, this Islamic Jesus is considered a prophet, not the divine son of God.
Crucial distinction.
And he returns, according to Islamic belief, to confirm Islam. But Richardson points out key parallels in the roles these figures play.
Unquote.
Like the Mahdi's expected reign of 7 years, mirroring the Antichrist's reign in Christian prophecy.
Wow.
Both figures establishing their seat of power on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem.
Oh.
The Mahdi making a 3.5-year treaty. Some Islamic traditions even mention it being with the Romans, interestingly.
Have the 7 years.
Exactly. And the Islamic Jesus abolishing the jizya tax.
Which is?
A protection tax historically levied on non-Muslims in Islamic lands. Abolishing it could potentially leave conversion to Islam or death as the only options.
Heavy stuff. And what about concepts like the Bay'ah and the Mark of the Beast? How does Richardson connect those?
He links the Bay'ah, which is the Islamic pledge of allegiance to a leader, like a caliph, with the biblical idea of submission and the potential for a forced declaration of faith in the end times. Regarding the Mark of the Beast, 666.
Yeah.
While he acknowledges technology could certainly play a role in how it's implemented.
Sure, chips or whatever.
Right. But Richardson believes the fundamental issue is a declaration of faith that denies Christ, especially in the face of intense persecution. And he notes that decapitation, mentioned in Revelation for those who refuse the mark, has historical links to Islamic contexts for those who refuse to convert.
This whole theory certainly seems to have gained traction, or at least attention, in light of current global events. How does Richardson connect it to the rise of Islamism and the increasing levels of anti-Semitism we're seeing?
He points directly to the growing number of, large demonstrations globally and the really disturbing increase in anti-Semitic sentiment and action.
Yeah, it's undeniable.
He also notes the sometimes surprising alliances we see between radical Islamist groups and elements within the far left, often fueled by anti-colonial ideologies.
The unlikely alliance, yeah.
Right. Where you hear increasingly open calls for the destruction of the state of Israel and even, horrifically, the genocide of Jewish people. He sees this as aligning directly with biblical prophecies that describe intense hatred towards Israel and the Jewish people in the end times.
Like Ezekiel and Joel.
Exactly. He references prophecies in Ezekiel and Joel about the nations gathering in the Valley of Jehoshaphat near Jerusalem, specifically to face judgment for how they have treated Israel.
The question of whether Allah is the same God as Yahweh is a really important one in these discussions. It comes up a lot. What's Richardson's perspective on that?
He offers a nuanced yes and no answer, which I think is helpful.
Boy.
He affirms that ultimately there is only one true God. When someone, maybe without a full understanding of God's revealed name, calls out to their creator, there is ultimately only one divine being they are addressing.
So metaphysically, yes.
Right. However, he argues that the character and the specific revelations about God as presented in the Quran are significantly different from those in the Bible.
Different descriptions, different requirements, different story.
Exactly. He cautions against being overly simplistic or dogmatic on this, but emphasizes that the God depicted in the Quran has distinct attributes and a different narrative than the God revealed in the Old and New Testaments.
Okay. Given these perspectives, which can sound quite stark, what does Richardson emphasize about the Christian duty? How should Christians view and interact with Muslim people?
This is really important. He strongly emphasizes the importance of love and respect for individual Muslim people. He makes a very clear distinction between the ideology of Islam as a belief system and the individual people who adhere to it.
Treat people as people.
Absolutely. He points out that many Muslims hold values that Christians can appreciate strong emphasis on family, modesty, the importance of prayer. He even shares some really inspiring stories of Muslims who are sincerely seeking God and have had supernatural encounters, angelic visits, powerful dreams that have led them to embrace Christianity. And he challenges Christians, asks if we are as dedicated to prayer and our faith as many Muslims are to theirs. His overall message is one of love, engagement, building relationships. Definitely not one of fear or hatred.
That's a crucial balance. Okay, finally, let's touch on the timing of the rapture. This topic generates, a lot of discussion within end times prophecy circles.
Understatement of the year, maybe.
Right. What's Richardson's stance on the popular teaching of a pre-tribulation rapture? The idea that Christians are taken out before the hard stuff starts.
Richardson is very clear in his opposition to the pre-tribulation rapture theory. Very clear.
Okay.
He argues that there's simply no solid biblical basis for it, and he stresses that Christians should be preparing themselves for potential suffering, following the example of Jesus himself, a tortured and crucified Messiah.
So prepare for hardship, not escape.
That's his message. He points to Matthew 24, verses 29 to 31, which explicitly describes the gathering of the elect occurring after the tribulation period.
After the sun darkens and the stars fall.
Exactly. He explains that when the Apostle Paul describes the rapture, say in 1 Thessalonians 4, it's generally inseparably linked with the resurrection of believers and the glorious return of Jesus. There's no mention of a separate 7-year period beforehand.
He also addresses the common idea that believers will be saved from God's wrath, right? Because that's a big argument for pre-trib.
Yes. He clarifies that being saved from God's wrath refers to the ultimate eternal judgment, God's final wrath, not necessarily being exempt from earthly trials and tribulations, even severe ones.
Okay.
He uses the example of the Israelites in Egypt during the plagues. God protected them through the plagues.
He didn't beam them out of Egypt beforehand.
Exactly. They were protected in the midst of judgment, not removed from it. He also shares personal stories, like his great-grandfather's persecution in Ukraine, to illustrate that God doesn't always rescue believers from suffering, but he is always with them through it.
A theology of presence in suffering, not absence from it.
Precisely. His message is a call to be prepared for hardship, to find strength in God amidst it, rather than expecting an easy escape hatch from difficult times.
Okay. For those listeners who want to explore these ideas further, learn more directly from Joel Richardson, where can they find his resources?
He directs people to his website, which is joelstrumpet.com.
joelstrumpet.com. Okay.
Yeah, and it has a wealth of free resources, articles, downloadable PDFs, lots of stuff. His books, The Islamic Antichrist, Middle Eastern Beast, they're also available for purchase there and, the usual online places.
Got it. And social media.
You can also follow him on Twitter, or X. His handle is @Joel7Richardson, JOEL, the number 7 Richardson.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into what is undeniably a really complex and thought-provoking perspective.
It certainly gives you a lot to think about.
Yes, and thank you, our listener, for bringing these fascinating sources to our attention. We hope this exploration has been helpful. We really encourage you to continue to examine these ideas, to delve into the scriptures yourselves, and to prayerfully consider how these different interpretations of prophecy might shape your understanding of current global events and your own faith journey. What does it truly mean to be prepared? Not just for blessings, but also for potential challenges, for hardship in light of these possibilities. That's definitely a question worth wrestling with.